Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair.
I call the
Mr. Chair.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we rise to speak to part one of this bill, and I wish to pick up the themes that my colleague, the Reverend Dr. David Clark, has just espoused. The first of those is, in noting that part one is the main operative part of this bill that internalises the new funding formula. And it contains the operative provisions that set the amount of child support that are required in the event that a couple contemplating separation cannot reach a voluntary agreement. There are a number of issues that arise in this part. The first of them is the complexity of the funding formula. And as Dr. Clark has told the House, the reality is that it took many hours of consideration for the members of the Select Committee, which at the time I was not a member of, to understand the mechanism embodied in this formula. It took officials a number of hours to be able to explain it to the members of the Select Committee. It has, as Dr. Clark has said, required the IRD to contemplate retraining their staff. So what? Mr. Chairman, the so what is, if it's that hard for professional officials and the average doctorate-holding Member of Parliament to get their heads around this, then it is sure as heck going to be difficult for the average Joe in the street or Jane in the street to be able to clearly understand their rights and obligations in the event that they can't reach a voluntary agreement. So transparency, the lack of it, and complexity are two issues that are built into this reform. Why does that matter? Because the incentives that the law really ought to be putting in place are that a couple can have every support to find a mutually supporting voluntary agreement to manage the transition from one family structure to another in the interests of the children. By not making transparently clear in a simple and easily understood form the counterfactual, then it's that much more difficult for couples who are already under extreme stress to be able to manage their way through that difficult period. Mr. Speaker, that of course brings us to another point which we debated quite vigorously in the second reading speeches, which is that the formula does not specifically prioritise the interests of the children. It is a fallback, and what it should have had, and what Labour members argued for, but which national members, I'm told, actually voted to block consideration of, was an accompanying provision, for example, in the purpose statement, which would have underlined the best of our jurisprudence, which is that the children come first. And what I understand informally is that there was resistance to that from the Minister and his office, because they were worried about litigation risk against the Crown. And I would have thought in these circumstances, vulnerable children, big powerful Crown, actually the Crown ought to be able to wear that risk in the interests of legal clarity for the common law. And that would have, it's also true, better served or better reflected Article 3 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is not specifically picked up in this bill. Mr. Speaker, there is, of course, turning to the substance of the formula, a real concern about the adequacy of the payments made. Submitters raised concern about that adequacy using the proposed formula, particularly given that a significant proportion of New Zealand's children are currently growing up in poverty. And as we said in the second reading debate, there are 270,000 children growing up below the poverty line in New Zealand. That's an awful shame. It's a stain on our national character, because those over 250,000 kids are going to have their lives and their prospects and their children's prospects impaired because they didn't get the start that we would expect every child to get. And of that 270,000, roughly a half, we're advised about 133,000 children, more than the population of Dunedin or Hamilton, are growing up in single-parent families, many of those, no doubt most of those, dependent upon child support. And it is essential, firstly, that the formula correctly upholds, Mr. Chairman,
David Cunliffe.
correctly upholds the interests of those children, and secondly, that the basic income adequacy is there for the liable parent to be able to meet those obligations. And two issues flow from that. The first is that we're embarked now on a debate about whether New Zealand should have expectations around a living wage. Well, too damn right it should, Mr. Chairman, because the counterfactual is that we're paying wages which might be legally lawful, but are acknowledged to be less than a family can possibly survive on. And the implications of that are taken out of the well-being and the future potential and productivity of the children growing up in that household. Mr. Speaker, let's turn to the pass-on mechanism. Expert submitters recommended using a pass-on mechanism to increase the collection of support payments. That is, if a liable parent knows that the money they're paying is actually going to go to their own children, international evidence indicates they're more likely to pay. At the moment, of course, the money goes to the Crown, and the Crown pays the child support to the custodial parent and the kids. And because that chain is indirect, sometimes the liable parents find it easier not to meet those obligations. Well, they should meet them. There's no justification for not meeting them within the terms of whatever agreement that couple has either agreed to or the legal minimum that is required. And too many liable parents have not met them and have built up child support debt. The current government loves to harangue the opposition for the fact that when it was in government it had less than $1 billion of child support. It's now $2.3 billion and climbing. $2.3 billion of child support debt that has not been collected from liable parents. And anything that can get that down is probably worth considering, including, I think, close scrutiny of the pass-on mechanism. Of course, the risk to be addressed is that if the pass-on mechanism is not supplemented by some fallback, then of course families could be in extreme poverty if they are not so provided for. We note, sir, that the Children's Commissioner in particular was critical of the understatement in the supplied regulatory impact statement, which said that pass-on may affect rates of payments. The international evidence is clear that it does so. Mr. Speaker, turning to the implications for women of the funding formula contained in Part 1, the legislation, of course, has very significant implications for women. On average, as is well known, women earn less than men and are more likely to be the primary caregiver. They are more likely to be in the vulnerable position here. And the actual effect of this bill is to apportion a greater share of the cost of child rearing to the women. A greater share of the cost of the child rearing goes to the women. Now, isn't that extraordinary? We know we've got a child poverty problem. We know the women bear the brunt. We know they're disadvantaged. But the great national government has brought to the House legislation that makes those problems worse. We believe, according to evidence that we've seen, that about 28% of that the 28% shared care threshold in the legislation is too low. Parents caring for a child 2 days a week are unlikely to share a proportionate responsibility for providing the basics of life. And while food bills might be able to be shared proportionally, the primary caregiver is more likely responsible for things like school costs, uniforms, clothing, medical, dental, and so on. And as every parent knows, this one included, those costs can really mount up. Mr. Speaker, let's just sum up the points that have been made in this part of the committee stage debate. There's a real problem with transparency. There is thus a problem with accountability. Couples do not have a clear counterfactual upon which to base their decisions. There is no pass-through, and women are worse off. Those are all serious issues with the funding formula contained in Part 1 of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to take a call in these committee stage